500 people were living inside James Fort in the autumn of 1609. By May of 1610, 60 were still alive. What happened to the other 440 is something most schools never explained, and the Smithsonian has the physical evidence sitting in a display case right now. Now let's get into it. She arrived in Jamestown, Virginia sometime in 1609. We don't know her name. Archaeologists at historic Jamestown, the actual site of the first permanent English settlement in North America, found her remains during a 2012 excavation. She had been buried in a trash pit, not a grave, a trash pit. She had been there for roughly 400 years, and when forensic anthropologist Douglas Owsley at the Smithsonian analyzed her bones, the pattern of cuts told a story that American schoolrooms have not told clearly enough. The official account of Jamestown is one of resilience, hardship, and perseverance, the kind of origin story that national mythologies are built from. Jamestown, established in 1607, is where English-speaking civilization in America begins. That is what we are taught. It's in the textbooks, it's in the historical markers, it's embedded in how this country understands its own beginning. What we are not taught, at least not with the specificity the evidence demands, is what happened inside that settlement during the winter of 1609 to 1610. What historians now call the starving time. And what the starving time required of the people trapped inside those wooden walls with no food, no allies, and no way out. I came to this story through something unrelated. I was researching the Virginia Company of London, the joint stock corporation that funded and organized the Jamestown expedition, trying to understand how early English colonialism was financed and who bore the risk when it failed. I wasn't looking for this. I found a reference to a 1625 manuscript written by George Percy, the colony's president during the starving time. And when I tracked down the document and read what he described, I put it aside for a while before coming back to it. I need to be honest about something that troubled me as I kept going deeper. This is not an obscure story buried in archives no one has access to. The bones of this girl are on permanent display in one of the most visited museums in the world. George Percy's manuscript has been known to historians for generations. The forensic analysis confirming what happened was published in a peer-reviewed journal, the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, in 2013. Major newspapers covered it. The Smithsonian held a press conference. And yet most people, when they hear the word Jamestown, think of John Smith. They think of Pocahontas. They think of survival and founding and beginning. They don't think about her. Let me give you the documented facts because this story needs to stand on solid ground. In May of 1607, 104 English men and boys established James Fort on a peninsula along the James River in what is now the state of Virginia. They came under the royal charter of the Virginia Company of London, a private corporation authorized by King James I to establish a permanent English presence in North America. The investment was commercial in nature. The colony was expected to locate gold, develop trade routes, and generate returns for its shareholders back in England. By the autumn of 1609, the settlement had grown to somewhere between 490 and 500 colonists. There had been supply ships, multiple waves of new settlers, and an expansion of the original fort. The Virginia Company was promoting the colony aggressively in England. Pamphlets, public speeches, recruitment campaigns aimed largely at the poor, the unemployed, and indentured servants seeking a new start. On paper, Jamestown was beginning to look like a real enterprise. Then the food ran out. The winter of 1609 to 1610 would later be called the starving time. By the time the resupply fleet arrived in May of 1610, only approximately 60 of those 500 colonists were still alive. That is an 88% mortality rate in a single winter. George Percy, who served as colonial president during those months, who was the 8th son of the Earl of Northumberland, and who was writing not as a fringe pamphleteer but as a direct witness, described what he saw in a manuscript now known as a Trewe Relacyon, which survives in the Alnwick Castle archives in Northumberland, England. Percy writes of colonists eating their horses, their dogs, their cats, rats, snakes, boiled leather stripped from their own boots. He describes a man named Hugh Price who murdered his pregnant wife, removed the unborn child from her body, and salted the mother's flesh to preserve it as food. Price was executed. But Percy is careful to note he was not the only one. Percy writes this in the tone of a man who had no choice but to witness it, because he was there, inside those walls, for every single day of that winter. The standard explanation for why the starving time happened runs like this. The settlers were English gentlemen, unaccustomed to physical labor, unwilling to work the land, naive about colonial survival, and largely dependent on indigenous food sources they had failed to secure. They starved because of their own failures of character and preparation. This explanation appears in textbooks. It carries a quiet moral lesson, a story of personal and collective failure that was eventually overcome. They suffered, they adapted, they endured. That is the narrative arc. Reasonable. Except for one detail that changes the whole picture. In 1998, a team of climate scientists published a study in the journal Science using dendrochronology, the analysis of tree ring width records, to reconstruct 770 years of climate data for the Tidewater, Virginia region. What they found was unambiguous. The years 1606 to 1612, which correspond precisely with the founding and near collapse of Jamestown, represent the most severe sustained drought in that region in at least 770 years of recorded climate history. The colonists did not simply fail to farm. They arrived into the worst drought in nearly 8 centuries. The James River, which they depended on for fresh water, grew brackish and biologically contaminated. Crops failed not because of laziness, but because the soil and weather could not support them. The Powhatan Confederacy, the indigenous political alliance that had initially traded corn with the settlers, was itself under pressure from the same drought, and from the presence of armed, increasingly desperate land-claiming strangers in their territory. The trade relationship collapsed. The land itself had turned against them. This detail is in the peer-reviewed scientific record. It rarely appears in the standard Jamestown classroom story. When it does appear, it tends to be presented as a footnote rather than a context-defining fact. Here is what I keep coming back to. The Virginia Company in London knew conditions were deteriorating before the starving time even began. Letters from the colony reached England. Reports of disease, conflict, and starvation were received by company leadership. By 1609, they were already organizing the Third Supply, a fleet of 9 ships carrying approximately 600 additional colonists to reinforce the settlement. Those ships encountered a hurricane in the Atlantic. The flagship, the Sea Venture, ran aground in Bermuda, an incident that would later inspire Shakespeare's The Tempest. 7 of the 9 ships eventually reached Jamestown, arriving in August of 1609, just months before the worst of the winter began. They brought hundreds of new mouths to feed into a settlement that was already running critically low on provisions and had no reliable local food supply. The Virginia Company had received reports of starvation, armed hostility with the Powhatan Confederacy, disease, and mass death. Their response was to send 600 more people. Now meet Jane. She arrived on one of those ships in 1609. She was approximately 14 years old, based on the forensic examination of her skeletal development, specifically the incomplete fusion of her growth plates and the eruption pattern of her teeth. She was English. That is nearly everything we know about her. We don't have her name. No passenger manifest that historians have confidently matched to her remains has been identified. She arrived in the final months before the gates of James Fort effectively closed for the winter of 1609 to 1610. She did not survive that winter. Some historians argue that the starving time is not hidden. It is simply calibrated for age-appropriate instruction, that the omission of cannibalism from middle and high school curricula is a matter of pedagogical caution, not deliberate concealment, that the academic record is open, and anyone who wants to find this can find it. I spent time with that argument. I wanted it to hold. It collapses under a direct comparison. American secondary school curricula routinely include detailed graphic instruction on the Holocaust, the Middle Passage, the firebombing of Dresden, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These are events that involve mass death, extreme human suffering, and profound moral complexity. They are taught, sometimes to students as young as 11 and 12, because the assumption, correctly held, is that historical education requires confronting discomfort. That is the premise of history as a discipline. The selective caution applied to Jamestown doesn't follow the same logic. What the full Jamestown story, with Percy's manuscript and Owsley's forensic analysis, actually reveals is not just settler suffering. It reveals the decision-making of the Virginia Company, a corporation that received documented reports of mass death and responded by expanding its recruitment of vulnerable English people. The popular fringe version of this story, by the way, claims the Virginia Company was engaged in some deliberate sacrificial scheme, some intentional and designed murder of the colonists for occult or conspiratorial purposes. I looked at that version carefully. It doesn't hold. The documented record shows something far more ordinary, and I think more genuinely disturbing. The Virginia Company was protecting its capital. It needed the colony to survive on paper long enough to attract the next round of English investment. It was a business managing the optics of a failing venture, and the cost of that management was measured in the bones of people like Jane. That is not a conspiracy. That is an institutional decision made while human beings were starving to death inside a wooden fort 4,000 miles away. Let me walk you through the sequence in full so the accumulation of it can land. 1606. The Virginia Company of London receives its royal charter. Recruitment for the first expedition begins. Promotional pamphlets promise fertile land, abundant resources, and the opportunity for a new life. 1606 to 1612. Tree ring climate records, reconstructed by scientists in 1998, confirm this as the worst sustained drought in Tidewater, Virginia in 770 years. No colonist was told this. The Virginia Company did not include it in their recruitment materials. May 1607. James Fort is established. 104 men and boys. Within 6 months, more than half of them are dead from disease and starvation. 1608 to 1609. Supply ships arrive and depart. Reports of deteriorating conditions, starvation, disease, hostility, reach company leadership in London. The company responds by organizing the Third Supply, 600 new colonists, recruited largely from England's displaced and indentured poor. August 1609, 7 of 9 Third Supply ships reach Jamestown, depositing hundreds of new settlers into a colony with no viable food supply and no stable relationship with local indigenous nations. Jane is among them. October 1609. Chief Powhatan formally withdraws his people's trade with the settlement. The gates of James Fort close for the winter. The starving time begins. Winter 1609 to 1610. George Percy's manuscript records the consumption of every animal within the fort, then the leather, then the recently buried dead. Colonists dig up graves. Hugh Price murders his pregnant wife. The population falls from approximately 500 to approximately 60. Somewhere in this winter, Jane dies. She is 14 years old. Her body is processed and discarded in a trash pit. May 1610. The resupply fleet arrives with Sir Thomas Gates and additional settlers. They find 60 survivors in a state of acute physical collapse. 1611 to 1624. The Virginia Company continues operations. The colony stabilizes, eventually through tobacco cultivation, a crop that will generate enormous profit and, within decades, generate demand for the mass importation of enslaved African people to work the fields. 1625. George Percy writes A True Relation. It is not published. It is placed in the family archive at Alnwick Castle, where it remains for centuries. 2012. Archaeologists at historic Jamestown uncovered Jane's bones in a trash pit beneath the original fort footprint. 2013. Douglas Owsley's forensic analysis is published. The evidence is confirmed. The record does not disappear. There is a skull in the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. You can visit it. If you stand in front of that display case and look at the forensic reconstruction beside it, the rendered face with reddish hair, the face of a girl who was 14 years old and arrived on a ship because someone in England told her, or told her parents, or told her employer that Jamestown was an opportunity, you are looking at a direct consequence of an institutional decision. What I find myself returning to, after all of this, is not the act of cannibalism itself. Extreme starvation produces extreme behavior. History documents this clearly. The Donner Party, the Siege of Leningrad in 1941 and 1942, where roughly 800,000 civilians died and where documented cases of cannibalism occurred in the city. The 1972 Andes plane crash, where survivors consumed the dead to live. In conditions of genuine terminal starvation, the human body outlasts the human taboo. That is not a moral indictment. That is a documented physiological and psychological reality. What I return to is the paper trail that existed before any of this happened. The Virginia Company had the letters. They had the reports. They made the calculation that the investment narrative mattered more than the survival odds of the people they were sending. George Percy wrote it down. Jane's bones held the evidence for 4 centuries. The climate scientists reconstructed the drought from tree rings that were growing silently in Virginia forests while the starving time was happening. The evidence has never been hidden. What I cannot know, and this is the question that stays with me long after the research is finished, is how many others shared Jane's fate and left nothing behind for anyone to find. The trash pit at historic Jamestown is one pit. The archaeological excavation of the original James Fort footprint is ongoing. Historians estimate that the remains of hundreds of colonists from the starving time have never been recovered. The ground at Jamestown has not given up everything it holds. How many 14-year-olds are still in that ground? And if we believe that history is worth teaching honestly, if we believe the documented record matters, why is that the question we never seem to ask out loud? If this video left you thinking about something you weren't taught, I'd ask you to subscribe. This channel exists specifically for stories like this one, where the primary sources say something different from the version most of us grew up with, and where the gap between those two things is worth sitting with. There is more coming. Subscribe so you don't miss it.